Hello and welcome to Sons of Ours podcast. I'm Jacob Machado here with not Tony Davis.
I'm
here with
it's Ian Wintering.
Ian Wintering. He had me start the podcast, but he's in the captain's chair still, so I don't know.
Today we're kind of changing things up a little bit, so
That's a little bit of a long time coming, but just kind of mix up the groups and address a topic that's near to both me and Ian's life today. Hopefully invite you guys into that a little bit, but I don't know about you, Ian. I am ready for retreat next week. I think you're on break, right?
Yeah, I'm on break, and I have been thinking about it nonstop for the past 2 weeks.
I woke up this morning, and it was one of those mornings where the first thing I thought of was when I could sleep again. But I'm on my coffee IV drip. We've got 50 minutes before we head to a conference with one of our professors here, and it's kind of rolling through the heart of the semester now.
Right, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and actually, so before we start this episode, we just wanted to kind of send out, I guess, an apology, because we've been having some technical difficulties with some of the equipment.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that we've solved it. We hope we have,
right.
But we've been having some, both in recording and then in post-production, we've just been getting some weird ghosts in the machine,
right?
And we're trying to figure those out. I know the last one you guys posted had some strange stuff with mic overlap, and
right.
Some have a weird click in it, and we're trying to work that out. But this is like our fourth or fifth responsibility here at Seminary, so it's not always project number one,
right? Sure.
And so yeah, sorry about any technical difficulties as well. But I guess that also takes us into just talking about feedback.
Right.
We've been getting some feedback. We love hearing from you guys. We get positive and constructive feedback. Have had no mean-spirited feedback yet, but
right.
So that's good. I think my favorite criticism that we got in the last couple of weeks, though, was one that said something to the effect of, "Man, if I knew these guys and they had a topic, I totally would listen to a whole episode." And I was like, "There's some snark in that. I like it." But yeah, we've been getting some feedback from some of you guys, some of your listeners. So one, thank you for listening. And we listened to some of the criticisms we've got, and kind of just started thinking about it ourselves and talking about it amongst ourselves. And I think one of the biggest ones was we didn't always seem like we had a destination in the podcast. We kind of would wander a little bit. And I think part of that, one of the struggles, one that you and I and Micah and Tony did a couple weeks ago, just having four guys and a conversation is very hard to keep
right
kind of in a somewhat linear direction.
Right. Yeah, especially just our personalities as well. Like I think everybody's just kind of jumping in and pointing us in totally different directions. And one of the feedback I received as far as that was that it was just way too confusing to keep track of who was talking and what was going on, because
we'd each had an idea and we wanted to talk about it, and it was exciting and cool, and we loved talking about Mary, but it was just a little bit too scattered. And so me and Ian have been talking about kind of what was the original purpose of the podcast. Has it evolved a little bit? What did Ian and Micah see it as? How did me and Tony see it as? And so I guess, Ian, if you want to share a little bit of kind of, I guess this throws back to probably the first episode when you guys were talking about it.
Right. Yeah, we kind of briefly mentioned it or even alluded to some of it in the first episode. But essentially, so a year ago, Micah and I were assigned to the Communications Apostolate, which in the past traditionally has just been, okay, we take pictures at the events of the seminary. We are in charge of the social media of the seminary. And that's pretty much it. Or maybe we'll set up for some sort of special event that's going on, right? Well, that became very overwhelmingly boring for Micah and I pretty quickly because, number one, so I went to film school. Micah definitely did not. But that also means that I know nothing about picture cameras. I know how to operate a film camera, but a picture camera and knowing how to take pictures and all the different nuances of that, I'm not familiar with that. Number two, neither of us have social media. And we were in charge of the Facebook of the entire seminary and the Twitter and the Instagram and all this stuff. It was very overwhelming. And it became very difficult for us to actually have some sort of engagement and in actual apostolate, right? It just became kind of this manual labor.
You're wondering kind of what are you doing? Why is this happening? Why do we even have this podcast, or not the podcast, but the apostolate?
Right,
kind of
right, exactly. Like, why isn't this just a guy's job that is hired by the seminary, to run the podcast, for example? Or
apostolate communication. So
right. But so essentially, what happened is we were talking about this with the communications director, Father Brady, and he had mentioned that in the past, under the previous administration of the seminary, they had posited the idea of starting a podcast, which has been done before. Catholic Stuff You Should Know is a podcast that was started here at the seminary.
Yeah, and that was started by a couple of priests, now priests, when they were still seminarians.
Right.
And it wasn't, kind of tied to the seminary. It was just two or three seminarians got together and said, hey, we're receiving so much information in our classes and in our studies that we feel so filled up. We want to be sharing this stuff. It's so cool. They really struck that point of wonder and awe to study more, but then they wanted to share it, to overflow. And so that's kind of where I think that the Catholic Stuff guys started from, was a desire to share what they were receiving.
Right. Whereas our origin is very different, right?
Yeah.
So again, Father Brady had said, okay, well, this has been an idea that has been posited before. Why don't you guys try it? And Micah and I sat down for, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 hours on a Sunday, trying to come up with what this vision of a podcast would look like. Because ultimately, as far as being an informational podcast, that already exists.
There's so many of those. The Catholic Stuff guys are doing informational topics. Bishop Barron does informational topics.
Word on Fire, right.
There's 1,000 out there.
Right, exactly. We didn't want to be another one to kind of just add to that fray, especially since they are by far doing it way better than we ever could.
Substantially better than us. We'll listen to them because they know more than us.
Right. Right. So, but one of our main goals as being a part of the communications apostolate was outreach, right? So the seminary itself is kind of a mystery to most people that live around here, or maybe even you don't know. Most people don't even know who seminarians are, and so it was kind of our job, kind of through the social media, to create that pathway for people to enter into the seminary or feel like they are a part of it, right? And so Mike and I had the idea of making that the podcast goal, which is to invite people into the seminary, into this mysterious place that many people only see when they drive by down on Steel Street or something, and invite us not only into the seminary, but into the lives of seminarians. That way, I remember when I was first discerning, I had no idea what the word seminarian even meant. So when a priest suggested, like, hey, have you ever thought about seminary? I was like, cemetery? What? And I actually had to Google search it. Because I had never even heard the word before. And so, again, having that opportunity for a broad range of people to be welcomed into the lives of seminarians, to understand where we come from, what we're about. And, yeah, that was kind of the idea for the ministry.
Yeah, when Tony and I picked up the baton this summer, we had a couple ideas of people we wanted to interview and talk about different seminary aspects. And I think those went really well. But then also, because there weren't a lot of guys around, we knew that there'd be episodes where we just kind of wanted to talk about what we do in our life, in seminary, on summer break, and kind of just invite people into that we're living normal lives ordered to a different calling, and invite everybody into that, but also invite you into kind of just a friendship and a camaraderie and a conversation at the dinner table almost. And I know that sometimes when you are entering into somebody else's friendship, sometimes it can feel a little overwhelmed because you don't get all the jokes, or you don't feel like you quite fit in. And so part of that, we might have joked too much of, with non sequitur jokes that nobody else is going to understand, but we think are hysterical. And so, we're aware of that from the podcast, but as well, like, we're trying to just share with you guys that, we're whole, healthy human beings, that we're engaged in natural friendship, and just have a life that we want to share with you. And so, yeah, it's not really our purpose isn't strictly to inform you of something. Our purpose isn't strictly to entertain you, but to really kind of start that dialogue and tell the story of seminary through the eyes of a few seminarians and the stories of a few guys, be it while they're in seminary or after. And so I think that's still kind of our focus and our hope going forward, and kind of, so it's a little more of a storytelling podcast, but as a way to foster and engage more of a dialogue with the listeners, with people outside of seminary, with people who support us in prayer or financially, to just kind of know a little bit more about our lives.
Right.
And I think...
And I know, too, Austin is one of our seminarians that has been doing door-to-door ministry in the area, and he has informed us of people that he's passed it on to that are not even Catholic or are lapsed Catholics. And so even that sort of, so I know that there's a big community out there that are kind of part of Austin's crew.
Man, now I really feel like we need to step up our game. we got these guys that are awesome. They go kind of door to door, kind of with that mission. Everybody's got a different mission in the church, and Austin's one of the guys that really has this call for evangelization on the streets, one-on-one, and He goes out. And so to hear that, he's sending guys back, that's kind of cool. But I do think that dialogue, one, we've heard some of the constructive criticism from listeners, and so it's cool because they're listening and they care enough about it to offer, suggestions, and then we need to receive that and hear it and kind of sit on it and not react, too rashly in one way or the other, to make a hasty judgment or to be so slow that we don't address it at all.
Right.
And so I think we're doing that, but that's dialogue as well. And I think that's at the heart of media, is a dialogue, is a message being presented and a message being received. But there's two human beings or more in that. And I just want to, that's kind of our topic for the day, is inviting you guys into E&I's perspective on the creation of media, but more so even just the creation of art. And so Ian, I don't know if you guys know, I think he said a couple times, went to film school.
Right.
But when we started talking about this, you shared with me kind of what brought you to film school in the first place.
Right.
And I think the listeners would benefit from that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, so I was actually kind of a late bloomer when it comes to interest in film. And that's always kind of surprising for the people that get to know me later, because they're like, what's your favorite classic film? And I was like, well, I mean, honestly, I haven't seen a whole lot of the classics because I kind of entered in late, if that makes sense. So I've always had to kind of backtrack and try to build up my resume, if you will. But no, the kind of the first interest that I really had in media in general was started when I was very young, because I always enjoyed the entertainment, or not the entertainment. I always enjoyed giving entertainment to others, if that makes sense, right? It was the storytelling aspect is kind of the key point, right?
Yeah.
And as a kid, that started it with just making up stories that weren't at all true, that I would paint out to be kind of true, right? In grade school, you kind of build some sort of story up. It's like, yeah, my dad dropped me off with a helicopter today. It was super awesome.
You tell enough friends, it becomes true, right?
Right, exactly. But my fascination with it was the actual process of storytelling, and I grew to fall in love with film in that same sense, especially when I encountered a movie series that was done by Christopher Nolan. Now, if you guys don't know who Christopher Nolan is and you've been living under a rock for the past couple of years, that's okay.
Couple of decades almost.
Yeah, just look him up on Google or something. But Christopher Nolan, what I've appreciated about him is that, so he is in a sense mainstream, in the sense that everybody knows him. Yeah. He's not some sort of underground movie artist. But he puts a lot of art into his film, right? Quote unquote, air quotes, art, in the sense that it engages you, it makes you think, and it's not purely for entertainment's sake.
Yeah,
right?
I think just art. I took the philosophy of art class last spring, and it was very interesting because the theory of art and what makes art kind of flow with the same theories of social political thought as well as epistemological and metaphysical thought. They're all thought is focused around a system typically. And so when there's a major shift in the way the world thinks about truth or thinks about how you can know something, art kind of reflects that. But then also the technological advances throughout history transform what art looks like. Photorealism used to be an ideal in painting, but then you had the photograph show up, and now you have something that can do better than you can as an artist with a paintbrush. Right. So what does it mean to be a painter now? What are you expressing? And so art is a very tricky one. We're not going to get into like a definition of what art is, but as me and Ian were talking yesterday, prepping for this, one of the distinctions we kind of wanted to pull out was there's entertainment, there's information, there's asking of questions, and then if you can kind of put all three of those together, you can have something that I think approaches art. Right. Because if it's just entertainment for entertainment's sake, we'll get into that a little bit later maybe, it really becomes, I think, pretty bad. If it's information just for information's sake, not a bad thing, but that's school, that's lecture, that's right. and so there's media creation in that vein, but I wouldn't call it art per se. Right. And then if you have something that's thought provoking and asking questions, it can be social commentary, but it's not necessarily art. But if you read a philosopher or a historian who can kind of weave the information into a beautiful kind of narrative and bring some stuff that's thought provoking and make it kind of entertaining, all of a sudden you're listening to like a lecture, but it seems artistic in a sense. It seems poetic even in a sense. Right. And so in any of these avenues, they can bleed into each other, but the more they become isolated, I think the less they become from art. I think the most dangerous of that is entertainment for entertainment's sake.
Right. Which is what that was probably 89%, maybe even higher, of what I experienced in film school, which ultimately ended up to my disillusion of Hollywood and what it would be like being a director or being an editor in that field, was just recognizing that ultimately the industry is driven by money, and what's fueling money is entertainment, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very rare that you get artists like Christopher Nolan who have enough gravitas to them that they can demand of the studio of what they want, right? And Christopher Nolan is strong enough that he could strong-arm a studio into making actual art versus just pumping out a blockbuster, if that makes sense.
And he's made enough films that are commercially successful that are also thought-provoking. I mean, the Dark Knight trilogy was wildly commercially successful. Yeah. It's telling a comic book theory or a comic book movie, but he's bringing in a whole bunch of philosophical theories. He's asking questions about humanity and the human condition. They're really a depth of movie and hope and despair, good and evil, right? That you don't necessarily get in most films.
Right.
And so you were in film school. How long were you in film school?
I did it for 2 years.
And my experience, because I was in the same vein. I started loving to make films. I made stupid little videos in high school, right? Little skits. I did a film and video class where my final project had to be a short story film that was I think it was 10 minutes. It was called The Traveling Car Salesman, who would sell cars that were parked on the street to people. I think it's still a funny idea. It holds up to this day, but I go back and watch that and just my filming technique is terrible. My lighting is technique is terrible. I have no audio production quality. I have terrible directorial skill for my actors because they're terrible. It's funny how bad it is. But that's just what started. I like you said, you like to entertain others. When I see a reaction of people, I keep rolling.
Right. No.
And it's awesome. I really enjoy that. And I think a lot of creative people, that's kind of a driving factor for them, and it gets you into it. But then if you get into the establishment of the entertainment industry, it can suck that so quickly. And so you got there. Did you even touch a camera for the first 2 years?
So I actually did.
Okay.
And that was only for one reason. One, because I didn't go to a university film school.
Yeah.
So because that was one of the options I was considering was UCLA or USC, which are kind of the main film schools in the United States. But the problem is that one, it's like $40,000 a semester. And two, you don't get a touch a camera to your junior year, which means
it's like 2.5 years of theory,
right?
That you're paying $40,000
right.
a year for, and you never once get any practical skill or practice.
Right. And if you decide to leave, which I ultimately did, that I would have been how much in debt? Like it just an insane amount. Yeah. And again, you look at like the big shots, Spielberg, Lucas, they didn't go to film school.
Yeah,
they started as boom mic guys or the coffee guy and worked their way up, right? And so that same kind of idea, I still wanted to go to school because I didn't know enough. I particularly was very interested in post-production editing. So I was kind of the guy behind the computer that takes all the shots and compiles it together. And I was actually very good at doing trailer editing, which is also a specific niche. I've always enjoyed trying to take a story, summarize it into one really cool point, and then displaying that within a couple minutes,
which is just a very good kind of pedagogical teaching skill to be able to take a lot
right.
and bring it down to kind of the bare bones to get the a message across.
Right, exactly.
It's not going to be the full, but it's a message focused.
Right. But so the community college I went to, it's a Scottsdale Film School, the Fighting Artichokes. Their colors are pink and green. I won't get into that. But so their whole idea is they don't offer a degree. They don't offer any sort of, again, it doesn't have this utilitarian purpose academically, right? So you go there and the whole point of taking these classes is one, to learn, I guess, like to learn how to use a boom mic, how to, maybe there's some film theory in there too. But the biggest reason is for connections. You get to know people, you make connections, you build relationships, and those relationships become favors, and those favors become job opportunities. Job opportunities become success, right? So that's kind of the idea behind that school. And so, yeah, we got to touch cameras freshman year, but they were like the crappy Super 8s from like the 1980s. You got to put the old Kodak film in there.
Yep.
So people who, if you understand how a camera works nowadays, you have all this autofocus, or even if you don't have autofocus, you could look at the viewfinder and check if it's in focus. Couldn't do that on Super 8s. You had to take a measuring tape, measure the distance between what you wanted in focus and the lens, do the math in your head, all the trigonometry and geometry, all that stuff, and then you determine at what point on the lens does this need to be in order for that thing, which is 6 feet away, to be in focus.
Yep. And if you're moving it in with like a dolly shot, you gotta know that you're going from 6 feet to 3 feet, and it's got to be in focus at 3 feet and at the speed you're going. And then you've got another guy. You've got one guy on camera who's filming. You've got another guy who's controlling the focus. It's called the rack focus.
Right.
And so as the dolly's being pushed forward, the rack focus guy is now also pulling the focus so that it remains in focus while it's moving.
Right.
And it's super cool stuff. And I mean, that's actually what I love about the creative process of film is all of these little jobs that make it happen. Right. I think that's what I loved and still love about seeing a film. I don't watch all of the credits, but I love seeing the credits roll by and just reading a few names because it's hundreds of people.
It's a whole city
to make a feature-length film happen. Yeah. And so I do think there's something really cool about that creative effort. But I don't know. You're starting to talk about kind of the industry and disillusionment about it, though.
Yeah. And I think part of it was that I began to very slowly realize that the industry was not interested in art, and that was the bottom line. They were interested in making money, and or even proclaiming some sort of ideological message. Right, the movie was for the sake of this one message that this guy wanted to make. Right. So, for example, in our freshman year class, we were assigned into groups of 4, and we each wrote a movie, and we had to help each other film each other's movies, right? And I was trying to make something creative, like I was just trying to express more of an experience in my own life. So I had a beautiful encounter with God when I was in high school, and I tried to paint a story that expressed that, right? So again, it didn't necessarily have a purpose or anything. It was more of just an artistic expression, right? And of course, I go back and I look at it and I'm like, oh man, that's terrible. Oh, that's so corny.
Technically bad.
Yeah. Actors terrible. And we're filming on a Super 8, so it kind of has a cool like retro kind of look to it, but it's not worth watching. But what I noticed is that all of the other films that we were filming were not on that same paradigm, right?
Yeah, not in the same intention.
Exactly. One of them even wanted, like, the whole movie, the whole script was literally an excuse for him to film this one explicit scene. Like, he built up a story just around this one scene so that he could say that he filmed this explicit scene. And it was just, it was a really hard challenge for me to kind of like wrestle with that morally. Like, okay, I'm involved with this film. Like, do I want my name on the credits with this? Am I going to like participate? All that, there's all that. And then there's also the fact of, the film industry serves the man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To make a
not man
reference.
The man,
right? And if the man does not appreciate or desire what it is that you are producing, then you are ousted. It's like, almost think of Hollywood as a clique, right? And so if this actress is not willing to do a certain thing in a certain scene in a certain movie, her name then becomes blacklisted by the man. And now her career is probably on the line. She will have a very hard time really getting any success in Hollywood. And so, especially when you're on the bottom, you really have to kiss the boots of those that are spitting on you in order to
it's very hard to remain kind of with personal ideals.
Exactly.
When you're trying to ascend the ladder. Once you've kind of reached a degree of status, of success, of artistic output as an actor or a director, you start to have a little more say over the parts you'll participate in. You have people coming asking you to work on their project, and so you then get to say yes or no, as opposed to you just knocking on every audition door and saying, I want a part. So it's a lot harder that way. Right. I do know, and I met some of them while I was in college, some of the kind of Catholic undercurrent of Hollywood. And there actually is a fairly strong Catholic community out in Hollywood, which is super cool. I was able to meet Steve McAvity when I was in college, and he's the producer that worked with Mel Gibson on a lot of his movies, from Braveheart to Passion of the Christ, and I think The Patriot and other ones like that. So he was a film producer, but he's very Catholic.
Right.
And so they're out there, but it's kind of hidden.
They have to keep it close to the chest, right? And you can even kind of see this with Christopher Nolan is, again, another example that I kind of hold up. He is a man that keeps everything very close to his chest. If you try to look up any of his opinions anywhere online, you will never find it, because he strictly makes the story for its own sake, and he is not going to have he's not very outspoken when it comes to any sort of ideology or affiliation with any sort of ideal, right?
It's something, a political opinion you had 10 years ago could blacklist you from working in 10 years.
Right.
And it's just weird. But I do want to cycle back. We're getting slightly off on a tangent, but obviously me and Ian enjoy film industry, the creation of film, talking about those topics. But you talked to me about story and kind of engaging with other people, that you produce something that has an effect on another. And I'd like you to just talk about that a little bit, and then I've got some thoughts as well on story.
Right, yeah. I mean, well, and to be honest, it's not even necessarily something that I produce that has an effect on another. Like, you can even be somebody else's product that I have found a certain sense of not enjoyment necessarily, but something deeper than that, like a fulfillment or
and enjoyment and entertainment is not bad in itself.
Right, no, but okay, we'll just say enjoyment.
Yeah, but it's something that has impacted you.
Right.
Has affected a movement inside your soul somehow.
Right. And so then I will then share that with somebody else, even if that means that I now have to watch this movie 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 more times, right? And yeah, the movie might become like boring to me, I guess, in a sense, because I've already seen this, but I actually enjoy it more because the person next to me is now engaging with this same material and is also enjoying it, you know, in that same sense. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just been, like, because people will always ask me, what is your favorite movie? And it's like, well, that, to anybody who actually enjoys movies, that is a very difficult question, because you have to make the classificational difference. You have to make a distinguishing difference between that which is purely for entertainment, because those can be enjoyable, right? Versus things are actually good quality movies, right?
Yeah. And it's fine if you enjoy some and not the others, and there's an overlap, and then you can go into each genre. Maybe you've got a favorite comedy, but then you've got a favorite drama, and then you've got a favorite thriller. Right. And it's hard to really cross-distinguish those as that movie being better than that, because they're different. Right. Just as a novel is different. You know, there's some novels that are a little more informative, historical kind of fiction, and then there's others that are just take you into this beautiful, intriguing world that this author came up with. And then you got, you know, thrillers that are pulling you into kind of a suspense, and it's hard to say which is best, but I think the movies or the books that you can keep going back to yourself, that you suggest to other people, it's saying that there's something here that has meaning beyond the entertainment. It has meaning beyond just the informative. That really transforms the consumer of it. Right.
And I think the greatest, or one of the best examples, for at least for me in this case, would be Band of Brothers, right? The Band of Brothers series, or even the Pacific to a lesser extent, right? Because that, I mean, yeah, sure, it's entertaining and it's also informative, right? In the sense that, you know, it's informing you about particular individuals' lives in World War II.
In a broad, true historical context.
Right, exactly. However, the thing that makes that a great piece of art is the impression that it leaves on the souls of the men that watch it, right? Especially men. Not to say that it's not impactful for women, but that movie specifically has, and I've seen it in myself and in others, when after you watch that series, you feel encouraged to embrace an authentic sense of masculinity.
Yeah,
right?
I think what it encourages in men, which is so lacking so often, is a sense of magnanimity, a sense of being part of a greater whole and serving for a greater whole as brothers together, to be able to accept not perfect conditions, to be able to accept danger, and to say, we're going to move forward for the good. We're going to try and achieve the good. And we don't know what the end is going to look like. We might all die, but we're gonna keep going forward. And there's something in that speaks to the masculine soul in a way that a lot doesn't in this world.
Right.
But that's that meaning, that's that depth that is pulling all of those things together. It's entertaining. Yeah, there's some funny scenes. There's really cool action scenes. There's good drama. There's a story arc that you have to stay with. You have to commit to. You can't just jump into episode 6 and understand it because you don't know the character yet.
Right, exactly. And I think another good example on the opposite extreme of a movie that has a lot of meaning, it's filled, jam-packed with meaning, but it might not necessarily be that entertaining, which you start to see a cultural divide here, right, is Babette's Feast. So Pope Francis's favorite movie, right? Yeah. And one of my favorite movies of all time.
I'll give that the Sons of Our stamp of approval. Go check it out.
Yes, yeah. That is an excellent classic of a movie.
Especially with Thanksgiving coming up. It's a great time to watch
But don't watch
Feast.
It when you're hungry. You got to do it after you eat.
True.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, but that's an example of a movie where you start to see this divide in people, where some people absolutely hate that movie.
Yeah. Well, because it's slow. It doesn't have a lot of humor. There's a little bit.
Right. Or it's very, very subtle humor. Right?
It's not really.
It's not action packed for sure.
But it is somewhat engaging, and then it's a thing you have to take in the whole. each from moment to moment in the film, it's not entertaining.
Right.
But when you actually invest the time to engage the movie from moment to moment, at the end, in the total picture of the film, it's incredibly thought-provoking.
Right.
And will turn you to kind of inner reflection on how you view the beauty of community, the beauty of food, I mean, I don't want to spoil it for you, but there's just so much in that film that you can ponder after the film.
Right.
And so it just kind of sits with you. But if you're looking for entertainment from moment to moment, which I think so many of our films today that are just entertainment it's, we have a 5-second attention span. So you do a 5-second bit, and then the next scene is a 5-second bit and a 5-second bit that is just constantly engaging kind of a sensory overload almost. And you never actually really sit back and think of the whole and ponder it and contemplate it.
Right.
And I think the story element is the core of that dialogue that we were talking about, because dialogue means you have something to talk about, something to say. And so story is where that begins. And I try to be a writer. I don't have enough time to really dive into it right now, but when I see something, I just see a greater meaning in it, and I want to ponder how I can express that. And I think film can do it. I think novels are a great example of it. Novels are media as well.
Right.
But when you're producing media, you have looked at the world and you have contemplated it, and you are trying to say something about it,
right,
and about the human condition. And when you can put that into a package and deliver it to people, that's the first part of the dialogue.
right,
But the consumer is also in that dialogue, because now the consumer is bringing their own perspective, their own worldview, their own past history, and a milieu of other things that's going to affect how they receive. In philosophy, we call it the quid, that something will be received by the mode of the receiver. So how the person receiving it is how they're going to put meaning onto it. So you've got two meanings already kind of clashing. The intended meaning of the creator and the meaning that the consumer or the receiver places on it. And then that's where the dialogue kind of can begin, because if you read poetry, the poet is trying to say something, but every single person is going to read a little different emphasis. And I think sometimes we're doing poetry criticism and we're reading and we're like, oh, I think this author's really, expressing this truth here and this idea. And that probably was never even in that poet's mind.
Right.
But because of the beauty of the whole that he's produced, it allows for further and further and further kind of circling into the depths of the truth that he's trying to express.
Right. Yeah, and I think the example that I keep thinking of is Lord of the Rings, particularly, which is a very rich universe that Tolkien has created, right? And if you know anything about Tolkien and his history, you know that he is very Catholic, right? And so this very Catholic worldview has been written into this universe. And I always love to get the perspective of particularly non-Catholics on how they have interpreted, for example, the Lord of the Rings, because they will start to see the truth that Tolkien is trying to express in our reality, in the reality of the Lord of the Rings. Yet they won't acknowledge it in our reality quite yet, because they're not ready for that, or maybe there's some sort of political reason as to why their mind has not assented to that. But in this fantasy universe, they're able to see what Tolkien is able to highlight as very true.
Yeah.
Right? And I just love that. I've just been fascinated by the secular media's acceptance of something that is so at its root Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And something that it's not expressly Catholic. And we see that sometimes with Christian films. It's like they're so in-your-face Christian
right,
that they actually just become kind of trite. And there's some really good ones out there too, but there's some that are just so bad because it's so trite, and that all it is it becomes preaching to the choir, and it doesn't even do that very well. But something that is actually true. We believe that God is truth, God is beauty, God is goodness. All of that is one in God. So if we produce something or consume something that is true, that is good, if there's truth, there's goodness in it, there's God in it, and I think Bishop Barron does this very well in many of his film reviews. He looks at it and says, what is true here? What is good here? What can we pull and say, what you are feeling, what you're receiving from this is good, and let's point you to the source of that good. Right. And so if we're able to do that, I think art and beauty can transform the world. I think sometimes we get into the transcendental mindset and we say truth, goodness, and beauty will save the world, and then we'll just step back and we won't do anything. Like, you really have to wrestle with truth and goodness and beauty because they're transcendental. They're beyond us, and we don't have a strict defined definition for them because we can't understand them in totality, because their totality is in eternity in God.
Right.
But we can engage it, and it draws us to God. It draws us into mystery. It draws us into wonder. And so if we're producing art, if we're producing even this podcast, if we can start to draw people into that while we ourselves are continuing the circle of contemplation, then I think it's an incredibly beneficial endeavor. But all too often, we don't consume well. I think producers, we talked about the film industry a little bit earlier about how they're producing for the dollar. They're economizing everything. Everything's a pragmatic decision to increase profit as much as possible. And if everything kind of becomes this economic mindset that we fall into, everything has to have a kind of utilitarian economic end.
Right. And
things can't really be ends in themselves or ends for community. And I would just challenge anybody who's listening to this to look at how you're consuming, because if you are listening to something and just want it to get the most efficient way to an end, a lot of podcasts are like business or self-help or things like that, and it's just the quickest way to change your habits to lose weight and make more money. It's pragmatic.
Right.
It's not art, and that's fine. But if that's what you want to then paint over everything, if you watch a film that's intended to be art with that mindset, you're going to be dissatisfied.
Oh yeah.
If you listen to a podcast that's intended to tell stories like ours, this isn't saying we always do this great, but if you're listening to our podcast, which just wants you to invite you into life and story, and you want it to be an information-loaded, kind of quick, I want to learn something about the faith, like, this isn't the podcast for you. Right. Because we're not trying to monetize the podcast. We're not trying to, we're not looking at it from the economy standpoint.
Right.
So there's that danger of kind of pragmatism and wealth, and we can project that as a consumer. But then also, am I just going in to be mindlessly entertained? Am I going in to just forget the world around me? Kind of shut off and, plug the matrix cable into my brain and just Christopher Nolan in Inception.
Right.
There's a scene, if you haven't seen it, it's too long, so I'm not even going to bother not spoiling it, but there's a scene where a bunch of people are hooked up to a dream machine, kind of as an opiate, and they just live their lives attached to a dream in a dream. And so the guy that the main character talks to tells him, when he questions that, is this a good thing? He tells him, their dream has become their reality, and who are you to tell them differently? Right. And so if you're doing that with entertainment, like if you're detaching yourself from reality, because reality's tough sometimes, and if you're making the dream a reality, that's an interesting question to ask. I think that should make us a little uncomfortable.
Right. Which is so ironic. That's so Christopher Nolan to put that message in a movie that you were watching.
Yeah, right. And so then the other thing too is, I think when it comes to art, it takes an active role from the consumer. You're not just we're the fast food generation. We want things immediately. And I think you see this in kind of like sitcom TV, that each show is produced to be its own little 20-minute entity so that you can jump in and out and in and out. And yeah, the more you watch, the more you'll kind of get to know the characters, but it doesn't really matter where you enter, where you leave. There's not really an investment. There's no commitment in it. And we love living that way in our lives. We love to come into whatever we want, feel entitled to, receive whatever we want, not really have to have a relationship or a commitment to anything, and then jump out.
Right.
We all do that.
Or even if it is a show with a large story arc of characters that demand your attention, right? I'm thinking of like Stranger Things, for example.
Yeah.
They give it to you all at once for you to consume all in one sitting, right?
Yeah, I can watch all 8 episodes in the next 2 days.
Right.
And so there's not really this investment in time, and I do think that's why I love novels. Reading novels is, I pick up a 600-page novel. I'm not finishing that. I don't have enough time to finish that quicker than like a couple months out.
Right.
And over that time, I, in a sense, develop relationships with each of the characters. The memory of reading the book is kind of parallel to memory of life.
Right.
And so now I've experienced characters go through things in their lives that I've never gone through. I'll read, Anna Karenina, and I see how a broken marriage can devolve and just spiral downwards. And if I've never lived that personally, but in the novel, I can engage with that experience, which actually makes me more empathetic, which makes me more understanding of other people's situations, which hopefully will allow me to be a better priest,
right.
Potentially spiritual director,
right. Or even in Band of Brothers, you're inspired by Lieutenant Winters.
Yeah.
Right? Like Winters is this this pillar of righteousness.
He's the virtuous man.
Yeah, yeah. And you watch that show and you're like, man, he actually reminds me a lot of Father Brady. I mean, visually he looks like Father Brady, but he also just the virtuous man.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, just when you're engaging in media, how are you doing it? Ask those questions. And we're, as producers of media, we're asking, what is our intention? What is our proximate end? What is our final end? How is this for the glory of God? And so thank you for your feedback. Everybody's sent us feedback. It's caused us to kind of ponder on these things, which has deepened our own, kind of lives reflecting on being creators.
Right.
But also just to throw it back into your court of like, how are you consuming media, be it podcast, be it film, be it novels? I don't know. Anything you want to add before we close up?
No, I think if you haven't seen any of the shows that we've referenced here in the show, you need to go do that.
Yeah. And if you would like to continue the dialogue with us, send out compliments or criticisms for us in the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at sonsofarspodcast, SONSOFARS podcast @gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you. Suggestions or just affirmations. Those don't hurt either.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And just remember that we did get that new email. Like it used to be, if you sent us an email in the past, it is not that other email because that is affiliated with the Communications Apostle. We are no longer part of that. So just make sure and send it to that new email.
Yes, sonsofarspodcast @gmail.com. And we look forward to getting back on throughout the semester and sharing our stories with you.
Yeah, God bless.
It's been Sons of Ours. Take care.
Ours with an A.
We don't do that anymore.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.